Welcome to this webinar and a series of webinars. This one with a specific topic on capacity development, assessing capacity development needs for the use of digital sequence information, which is conducted by the ABS Capacity Development Initiative in the partnership with the government of Norway and South Africa, and in collaboration with the African Union Commission. I would then ask Professor Tim Hodges from the McGill University, whom you may probably know also in his former function, having been one of the co-chairs of the working group on the Nagoya Protocol, and with his vast and long-standing experiences in the international fora, we asked him to share some views on what we call the bigger picture. Basically, what is it that we need to refer to and take into account when talking about capacity building in relation to the convention, in relation to digital sequence information. As we heard in the discussions so far on the different policy options in the room, that one of the few undoubted and unqueried elements is that improvements need to be done in terms of capacity building. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Suel, for the kind remarks. I assume you can see my presentation, the first slide.
Very well.
Thanks again. Hello, everyone. Before I launch into my, which I trust will be a very brief presentation, but a helpful one, before I launch into the overview, I'd simply like to underscore the fact that I am speaking in my personal capacity, based on, as Suel described, too many years, perhaps, in multilateral affairs, but a significant amount of experience in and around some of these issues, both currently and previously. Let me just say at the outset that for many years I've been puzzled by the fact that the clear interlinkages between the CBD, the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and more recently, the Nagoya Protocol on ABS, and between biosafety, biotechnology, benefit sharing, and capacity building. Those interlinkages seem to me to have been very widely ignored. Perhaps not deliberately, but clearly, in my mind, they have been ignored by the parties, but also by the stakeholders. So I've been asked to speak about the context in and around DSI. I'm not a DSI expert, although I'm sure many of you are participating today and also watching. So for you, I apologize. This may strike you as a bit too conceptual and maybe too retrospective. But please be patient. I can assure you that this is not an academic lecture. And as many have said, you can't know the best way forward when you don't know where you've been. Right. So, the three objectives of the convention. We're all familiar with them. We're also familiar with our tendency to, most of us, in fact, to emphasize one objective over another, and principally either conservation or benefit sharing objectives. And to me, that seems quite wrong-headed, because in my mind, the three objectives are inseparable. They're actually symbiotic elements, and they can't, in fact, be, conceptually at least, be separated. Perhaps legally, they have been and interpreted that way, but in my mind, one, it doesn't make any sense, and two, it's actually counterproductive, particularly, as you all know, because we have a tendency in government and in human affairs to silo things, to separate things. And the result of that is when we prepare for discussions emerging issues such as DSI, for example, we have a tendency to silo those issues and develop positions based on silo thinking, and then attend meetings with further siloization of the actual issues. So that's counterproductive from the perspective of what we want to attain in terms of all three objectives. So briefly, even after, say, some 30 years since the convention entered into force, we still have a range of views about how it came into force, how it was negotiated, and what was the nature of the so-called grand bargain which led to its adoption. There's at least three different understandings about what the nature of that grand bargain, and I've listed them on the left-hand column. And it's amazing to me, it's striking that we still have difference of understanding. Now, these differences are legitimate, and no one's right and no one's wrong. But if you actually stand back and look at what the result of those differences might be when interpreting emerging issues, or even interpreting the articles of the convention, of course it leads to well, differences of views, legitimate or otherwise. I'd just simply like to remind you that when the convention was negotiated, we were very much in the green revolution. It was rolling with biotech and technology in general, seen as tools to transform biodiversity into value, so-called green gold. All one needed were the tools and the know-how from the North to accelerate made-at-home technology, biotech in the South. My own assumption about the convention over the years that I've been involved in it was that it was very much centered on things that are physical. And that's how I've approached the issues that I've been involved in, not just ABS, but also biosafety, for example, and technology transfer and capacity building. When I was negotiating those issues for my own country, for Canada, I assumed that this was really about things physical. But more recently, when I've actually looked at the convention, I realized that, in fact, the CBD does not discount the value of information. Not at all, in fact. And I'll get to that shortly. Right, prima facie, the convention is about biodiversity. But that doesn't really tell you much about what it's really about and where it's meant to go. I've listed a number of issues, a number of themes that the convention more than touches on, actually tries to grapple with. And my simple point here is that in my mind, the CBD is ultimately about sustainable development. Conceptually, it's much easier to understand what's going on within the convention and discussions and interactions with other fora if you understand it as more widely encompassing as sustainable development, as a discussion and a debate about sustainable development. Over the weekend, I had an opportunity to look at the preamble of the convention. I hadn't done that in perhaps 2 decades. And when I look at it, these are selective passages or paragraphs from the preamble. It certainly underscores the amount of space in the preamble, and therefore I would say in the discussions informing the negotiators and the shape of the CBD back in 1992. How much space was spent on technology transfer, on enabling technologies, on resources to enable technologies and transfer, and the sharing of benefits. It's actually quite striking, the amount of space and obviously the preoccupation with those issues back when the convention was being drafted. And so that is still the case today. Right, moving more quickly now. These are what I call the forgotten articles, and maybe even the forgotten obligations of the CBD. Forgotten by many, not just the North, not just the South, not just a small number of stakeholders, but by many people, including negotiators of the CBD subsequently to its adoption. I don't intend on going through the articles in detail, but merely pointing out again selectively some of the themes that are covered across these 4 articles. For example, Article 16, just citing it for a moment, recognizes both access to and transfer of technology among parties are essential elements for the attainment of the objectives of the convention. Accessing and transferring of technologies from one party to another. Article 17, parties shall facilitate the exchange of information from all publicly available sources. Article 18, parties shall promote international, technical, and scientific cooperation in the field of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Article 19, parties shall take legislative, administrative, or policy measures as appropriate to provide for the effective participation in biotechnological research and development, especially among developing countries. So again, emphasis on information, on technology transfer, on enabling the development of biotechnology for the benefit of all parties, in particular developing country parties. Technology transfer in multilateral agreements. In my experience, in negotiating and being involved in technology transfer discussions in many fora, regional, bilateral, global, those who that negotiate these provisions are not technology transfer experts. They tend to be diplomats, or in the case of CBD, environment ministry types. And in fact, ultimately, what we see is, I think, a lack of treatment of technology transfer in a serious manner, and a very classic dance between the North and the South. And the cynic in me thinks, well, that's because people are undertaking disingenuous, or they have disingenuous motivations. But it's more sophisticated and more complicated than that. There are many factors behind the lack of interest and lack of delivery on technology transfer in the convention and in other bodies. And that includes the disincentives to transfer tech and expertise to potential competitors. The change in technological prowess in a number of large developing countries, and the fact that many developed countries don't own the underpinning IP on which rests public research funds in many cases. So, capacity building in the convention, it is somewhat limited, as I mentioned, in the case of technology transfer, and the same applies to capacity building. There is plenty of space, articles, texts on capacity building. There's certainly been a number of discussions, but it tends to focus on enabling legislation rather than enabling biotech, even though the convention reflects both with both aims. So I would say they are, the provisions themselves aren't weak, but the resulting discussions and actions are relatively weak, even though there have been some important exceptions in terms of bilateral and regional support for capacity building, and of course through the GEF. Those are important, but in my mind, not sufficient to deliver on the convention's vision for capacity building. Similarly, in the Cartagena Protocol and its sister Nagoya Protocol, we have provisions on tech transfer, on information, and on capacity building. But interestingly, in the case of Cartagena Protocol, its focus is on what not to do. So avoiding any environmental or human impacts of LMOs or GMOs, so it's about regulating and preventing rather than facilitating. At least that's the interpretation of it. It's more than that when you read the convention, the protocol itself, in my mind. But that's the emphasis, and that was the emphasis at the time it was negotiated. Nagoya seems to be more facilitative. It wants something to happen. On the other hand, it's also intended, in my mind, or many people's minds, to eliminate misappropriation, biopiracy, and unsanctioned access to genetic resources. So again, it's working to ensure something doesn't happen. Nevertheless, in Nagoya as well as in Cartagena, the provisions on tech transfer, information, and capacity building are not that weak, but they're just not that actioned, in part because of the psychology we take and attitude we take to both of those protocols about preventing something from happening rather than facilitating an action. So, like the convention, the articles in the protocol on information, capacity building, financial mechanisms, and resources are substantial. They're just not focused on long-term investments and more on, understandably in the short run for Nagoya, on actually implementing legislation in countries. That's fine, that's legitimate. But ultimately, in my mind, capacity building has benefited principally the lawyers working on it. So, with or DSI? Where does DSI fit in all of this, if it fits at all? I think we can agree that DSI is important. Otherwise, we wouldn't be spending so much time on it, would we? Whether we want it or not, we are discussing it. And as my old boss used to say, it's like water on your roof. It must go somewhere. Even if you don't want water on your roof, it needs to go somewhere. It needs to be managed in order to prevent more negative things from occurring. That may be a negative image, but actually I think from a negotiating standpoint, that's the reality. So I think we would agree that the issue is going nowhere. And it certainly isn't going nowhere as technology advances and as information leverages more value from that information, right? Information leverages value of information. So it's not going anywhere. It seems to me, though, try to turn this around, that the question we should be asking is, in fact, if we decide DSI merits our attention and action, the question is this: to what purpose should it serve? What is the purpose? So we start at the end rather than at the beginning. What is DSI? And the questions that we have been quite helpfully addressing over the last several years. But I actually think we should be asking, to what purpose should DSI meet? What purpose should it meet? Clearly, in my mind, DSI fits in the capacity building, capacity development space in terms of both biodiversity and biotechnology, and obviously on the technology transfer spectrum. Perhaps we could also ask, can DSI serve the CBD and the broader sustainable development goals? I mean, I think that's really the question. Can it support action on the forgotten articles, as I described them, and obligations of the CBD and its protocols? Can it further support, in other words, the three objectives of the convention? Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Tim. I think that was a very interesting overview indeed, as you said, where we're coming from and in what context we would need to see now these ongoing reflections on capacity building and development related to digital sequence information. And I think that this also feeds then into the purpose of these series of webinars, which is to enhance the science policy discussions around DSI to feed into the working group. Now, having heard more about the context, I think it's now good to dive a little bit deeper into the subject matter itself and what could be potential capacities to be reinforced that are needed when handling DSI and also becoming possibly a player in that regard. And with that, I would like to hand over to Hartmut, my colleague Hartmut Meyer, who is the team leader of the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. And Hartmut, we are eager to listen to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. As said, I'm Hartmut Meyer. I'm very pleased to see a lot of people attending this online event. We're almost 100 participants. That's very encouraging. And I'm going to give you a very quick overview about the two sides of capacities which we are talking about. And it's about what are the DSI users and what might be examples for using DSI. I will show some slides on the DSI users and the origin of DSI, which are adapted from previous events which we conducted. And I will very briefly just show you 3 examples of research and publications, 2 of them from Africa, so to see what is going on, especially in Africa. And from there on, we could then also discuss what capacities are needed to actually use DSI. At first, a very quick glance into the INSDC, that's the International Nucleate Sequence Database Collaboration. It's a network of 3 data banks in Japan, in the US, and in Europe, actually. That's one of the main repositories of sequence data. So we heard in our first webinar in December 2020 that every 6 minutes there's a new data set. We have 2 times 10 times 9 sequences, so that's an enormous amount of information, of data in those data banks. We have 2 million taxa covered with these data, and there is thousands of users, of consumers per month. So it is it's a vast network of people who submit data and of people who download these data again. And also, it's not just about data provision. Also, these data banks give support to their users. So it's around like 46 tickets per day. That means contacts to the technical experts, and there's also in-person training. The infrastructure as itself is very impressive. It's a huge data storage, and it costs this consortiums about $50 million per year to run this side of the DSI story. So here we can say that actually there is a lot of money and also a lot of capacity that is used to store the DNA and DSI and to distribute it. What actually are the users? These are numbers which came from a study for the CBD and were also presented several times. So it's that essentially users from all over the world are using this DSI, but there is, of course, a concentration of those users in countries with, I would say, advanced biological sciences. So the United States and China and India, Japan, for example, are the top users. And it's calculated that there's $3 to $5 per annual costs per user. And also the data show that 50% of the users live in countries that do not contribute to the infrastructure costs. So that is seen also as some sort of benefits. And there was also a big question, where is the DSI coming from? Actually, from which countries are the genetic resources, which were the source of DSI? In many cases, this geographic information is available, not in all, but in many. And also here it is apparent that about half of the sequences come from 4 countries. This is like China, United States, Canada, and Japan. But also, let's say, typical biodiversity-rich countries from the south are represented, like Brazil, for example, or South Africa, etc., but not to that extent as other countries. So now, quickly turning to the side of using this information. So what are typical examples? I present a very recent publication of a group from researchers at the ILRI in Kenya and in South Korea. It's sequencing African indigenous cattle. And for example, that was a very big task. I think about 12 indigenous cattle breeds were sequenced from 4 countries. There was a huge amount of sequence, of course, generated in this exercise. They are all uploaded to GenBank. That's the one partner of this international DSI network. So it's available all over the world. The researchers took 217 publicly available genomes from these data bank, which were already uploaded by other researchers to analyze their data. And it then resulted in a huge statistical analysis to essentially see how was the evolution of African cattle. The ultimate goal is, of course, as the authors write, to open the door for sustainable crossbreeding programs. So that means that these data which are uploaded essentially should be used for breeding purposes in the end. The second example is from South Africa. Researchers checked microbes which they found in contaminated water aquifers in sites in South Africa. And I would say that this was, let's say, not such a huge work as we just saw. It was more straightforward, actually, to isolate and to determine the taxonomic structure of microbes in these sites. So what did the researchers do? So they extracted DNA, they amplified certain sequences from the ribosomal RNA, which is I think a standard method in taxonomic research to identify taxonomic groups as the genus or the family. There was sequencing of genomic DNA involved, and that, interestingly, in this publication was given to a commercial DNA sequencing company that also shows that these capacities can also be in service providers. They don't need all to be exclusively, for example, at universities. And they used usual software like the BLAST analysis and statistical analysis to check their data. That is something more or less research rooted in taxonomy, but with a very clear focus on the future use, for example, of certain microbes in the field of bioremediation. And finally, we have a paper that is, let's say, a projection into the future. So those authors from India thought about what is necessary really to apply synthetic biology to microbial remediation. Here we can see that a lot of different pretty complex methods are suggested to really construct synthetic microbial communities in the end. It's metabolic engineering, for example, genome editing, data mining, etc. So that this is not existing research. It's a lot of examples of specific pieces of research which were already done in this field. And so this would, for example, require very vast capacities in potentially several institutions to really apply these synthetic biological methods. And also that example also shows that in a lot of cases where DSI is actually used and where DSI is used to change the metabolism of organism, we will end up with genetically modified organisms, GMOs or LMOs, as the Cartagena Protocol calls them. And there, in cases where DSI actually is used to engineer other organisms, we also enter the field of biosafety, especially risk assessments. And here, I think it's very obvious. So if those engineered microbial communities should be used in open air in the environment to do their job in polluted environments, of course, there need to be sufficient also biosafety capacity to assess potential risks and to secure that those microbes do their job as foreseen and stay there and do not harm environment. Well, with that, I can close my very quick overview, and you can see that a lot of research is actually going on also in developing countries like in Africa. And I think with this, we have a good opportunity to enter into our panel discussion on what kind of capacity is actually needed to use the DSI. And with this, I like to open our panel discussion. First, I'd like to introduce the three panelists. We have Amber Hartmann-Scholz. She's the Deputy Director of the Leibniz Institute of the German Collection of Microorganisms and Cell Cultures. Amber was instrumental in making this German collection the first registered ex situ collection under the EU ABS compliance regime. That means that, in brief, the accessions which are there and can be accessed publicly are accompanied by the necessary ABS documents, as for example, the MAT, the ABS contracts, as required by the provider countries, of course. She's also author of CBD studies and other work on DSI, and very much involved in the discussion of this topic in the recent time. Our second panelist is Ahmed Birouk. He's a professor at the Hassan II Institute for Agronomy and Veterinary Medicine in Rabat, Morocco. He undertakes research and training on genetic resources and also plant biotechnology. And he is a member of the Moroccan National Committee for Biodiversity and has participated in international meetings and African meetings for a long time. And finally, we have Sunday Igu Rox Akile. Sunday is based at the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD Regional Office in Nairobi, in Kenya. He's the Senior Program Officer for Legal and Policy on Biosafety Issues at the AUDA NEPAD office. And as this Senior Legal and Policy Officer, he leads regulatory development processes and policy processes on biosafety for the countries in the African continent. With this, I like to start with Amber, actually. I think, Amber, you prepared?
Yeah, I was getting confused. I thought that Ahmed was going to go before me, but I'm happy to jump in, and I was being tickled to turn on my camera, so I accepted the request. So, okay, here I am. And if you want me first, you got me. Careful what you wish for. Good morning, good afternoon to each of you out there. I'll try to speak slowly for the translation. I wanted to just start to the big picture, just to confirm what Hartmut said, which is that the use of DSI is fundamental to any kind of use of any type of biology, any kind of life sciences that you do nowadays. You have to use DSI probably at some point during your investigations. And this is just a very broad. Hartmut gave some excellent examples, and I was requested by the organizers to mention some of our own work that we do here at the DSMZ. So some examples in Ethiopia, we're working in high altitude ecosystems. We're really interested in in so-called islands, biodiversity islands, where there's not a lot of exchange between organisms, and we're comparing those communities in the high altitude mountains to communities in Colombia, for example. So we have to have access to organisms and the use of DSI in both Ethiopia and Colombia. Through the European Virus Archive project, I spoke to colleagues this morning, actually working down in Pretoria in South Africa, that are looking at rabies viruses and exchanging them with the United Kingdom and a number of colleagues around the world to understand rabies viruses, right? Which of course, huge risk for children when they get bitten by a dog. So a really important thing. We can't see viruses, as you've learned. And so we have to be able to look at them with sequences because we cannot see them with our eyes. You all know about the pandemic happening. And then an example of colleagues here, there's been a really dramatic loss of cassava, which is a staple crop throughout much of Africa. And that's been caused by a new virus. And so we have colleagues here that are working on cassava virus. So just a couple of examples that came to mind in the last few months. I wanted to take a step back, and Hartmut's introduction is a great one, to say, and also connecting to what Tim had said, is the use of DSI a one-way street? You know, is this really an us versus a them, north versus south kind of situation, or is it not? And instead of talking about that from a belief point of view or from a policy perspective, I thought it might be helpful to look at it from a data point of view. I really believe in the power of data to tell a story. And the fundamental question that I've asked with colleagues here in Germany at the IPK in Gottesleben and with Guy Cochran at the EMBL EBI is, let's look at all 18 million sequences in the databases that have country information associated with them. Let's look at a couple 100,000 publications that cite DSI. So Hartmut and I have given you a couple of examples, but let's look at 100,000 all at once. And let's ask, where are those authors when they cite that DSI? Are they sitting in Nairobi? Are they sitting in Braunschweig, Germany? And where did the DSI come from? And that's this, the results of that question are in this slide. So you can see that here. So on the bottom, you're looking at where did the DSI come from, the genetic resource, not where it was sequenced, but the actual country of origin. And for simplicity's sake, because there's 200 countries in the world, we've broken that data down into 3 groups: BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa; G77, a placeholder for developing economies; and OECD, a placeholder for developed economies.
And Amber, a little bit slower for the translation, please.
Sorry,
thanks a lot.
Absolutely. My apologies. I told you that would happen, Hartmut. My apologies. So on the bottom, you're looking at where it came from, divided into 3 simple groups. On the left, on the y-axis, you're looking at the publications that cited DSI. So somewhere they're talking about malaria, they cited, we use these sequence numbers, and they had the unique identifiers in that publication. And there's really 3 things that you can learn from this data. Sorry, and then the blocks within the graphs, I forgot to mention, are where the first author of the paper was sitting. Were they sitting in one of the middle income countries, low income, or in a high income countries? And there's 3 important things I think that we can learn and that hopefully inform the rest of our time together here today. So the simple answer is that the use of DSI is not a one-way street. So why do you know that? Because you can see for all 3 groups, of where the DSI came from, there are scientists in all parts of the world using that, right? So you don't see only turquoise here and only dark blue here, but there's an equal distribution. Another important thing that you look at and see from this is that scientists tend to use local DSI that they've generated and probably worked on, that they sourced from nearby. That's easier than going abroad and doing an international collaboration. So how do I know that? Because if the sequence data came from OECD countries, the biggest chunk of users is also from the OECD. And then if you look at G77, the biggest block in this graph is again the G77, right? So G77, the developing country scientists tend to use their own data more than the other groups. And again, the same trend in BRICS, right? So in each of these columns, the biggest amount of users, they're using their own DSI. This means it's not a one-way street that some northern scientists is exploiting a megabiodiverse country, but really that it's a preference sort of for one's own DSI. However, there are important gaps. So OECD DSI is used 3 times more than BRICS or G77 DSI. How do you see that? You see here, that's 30,000 publications roughly from BRICS, 30,000 from G77 countries, but 90,000 using OECD DSI. That's a problem when we talk about the global biodiversity framework, because what we want is to understand the DSI from all over the world in order to understand the biodiversity from all over the world. So what we need to do over the next 10 or 20 years is to fill in the gaps in these areas of the bar graph, right? We want to have more DSI from BRICS and from G77 countries. And Hartman already showed you the maps, right? We already saw how dark China is, how dark the US is. And we want to increase the availability if we want to understand biodiversity and we want to enable sustainable use. And a final point that we can see here is, again, to the question of gaps. There are 35 to 40% total fewer DSI-based publications from scientists in low and middle income countries, from those authors, relative to OECD authors. So you get that statistic if you add up all of the blue, all of the what do you call that, cyan, and then all of the turquoise across. So a comparison of approximately 65,000 to around 40,000 for each of those. So these, I think, are the gaps. And I firmly believe, and I would like to wrap up here, that DSI is an incredible capacity development opportunity because it is a hidden leapfrog opportunity. Leapfrogging in the policy context is this idea that a technology can enable development to skip over the phases that other countries had to go to. So the classic example, of course, is cell phone technology. With the lack of infrastructure in telecommunications in many developing countries, cell phones enabled many people in the developing world to connect to the internet for the first time. So cell phones were the leapfrog technology. I think that DSI and these huge open access databases are a leapfrog opportunity. Why? Because you don't have to have $1 million sequencing machine in your basement anymore. You do not have to have a huge terabyte server in your basement anymore. Why? Because of these huge open databases. What you need to have is some good thoughts, some good questions. There is more data here in these databases than can ever actually be answered by any scientist in their lifetime, manyfold. And so the goal for me is, or I think for the community, could be to fill in these gaps and to figure out ways that we can use DSI as a leapfrog towards sustainable development and sustainable use.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Amber. So I think that was a very good introduction into, actually what is done at an international level in cooperation. And now I like to pass over to Ahmed, who is concentrating actually on also concrete work and giving us his ideas on what can be done and where are still gaps. Ahmed, please.
Thank you, Hartmut. I hope you hear me.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, everyone, and thanks to the organizers of this important meeting. I'd like to share a small presentation. Where is this present here? I hope you see the presentation now.
Yeah.
Okay. In fact, I'm happy to quickly present some elements on capacity development needs. In fact, for a researcher like me on genetic resources in a developing country, I have always been faced with the challenge of collecting and conserving genetic resources, and in some cases, valorizing them in a physical way, as it is in this diagram, in compliance with the Nagoya Protocol. But with the use of molecular sequence data, we have entered a new era that is both fascinating and slippery, as the intangible transfer and use of DSI is beyond our control, and at the same time requires us to have new capacities which allow us to keep up with the rapid developments in order to monitor research and also to advise administrative officials of the Nagoya Protocol. Then developing national research for the use of DSI from genetic resources needs a substantial capacity building efforts, including first, a better understanding by researchers of DSI issues from start to finish. It's a matter to increase awareness of the national researchers involved who may be captivated by the need for publication of new sequences or scientific papers. Second, there are needs in some specific disciplines in science and technology, like sequencing, genetic engineering, barcoding for taxonomy and identification at infraspecific level. Third, for all data transfer and utilization steps, skills in bioinformatics are currently lacking, and we need to better master analysis and processing of big data related to the DSI. Also, we need improved access to all international data banks. Other capacities are needed: availability of research networks at the national or sub-regional level with well-built projects and transparent sharing of tasks among several labs. Because in our context, no single laboratory could master and handle all the steps related to the DSI from generation to their use. Also, strong links between public and private research is needed. If you admit that in our situation, public research is more oriented towards the generation of data and knowledge, while private research could better use and apply this knowledge. For all of this, the availability of qualified human resources and infrastructure is obvious by opting more for service laboratories and not for many sophisticated labs at the same country or province. Of course, this is a long-term vision of capacity building in which more emphasis could be placed on a regional or sub-regional approach, allowing the pooling of countries' resources and the use of sub-regional centers of excellence that are existing or to be identified and reinforced. It could easily be coupled with biosafety issues in some extent, at least for the detection and identification of LMOs. It would be necessary to take stock of the activities currently being carried out in each country or sub-region and the constraints and gaps that need to be addressed, which are obviously large in our African countries. A political will should support the researchers' choice if these choices are realistic, of course. With these conditions, national researchers can work in an efficient manner with less frustration and be really a part of the solution. I will stop here. Thank you, Hartmut.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I think we will come back to this overview later and see what actually could and should be done in the various fields. And finally, I'd like to ask Sunday. There he is. Okay. Sunday working, of course, now in, let's say, a more regional context and coming from the biosafety side, which as we see is also related to the DSI utilization. We invited him to explain a bit more about institutional and capacities and the regional context in which such capacities should be developed. Sunday, please.
Thank you very much, all of you participants, experts. Good morning, good afternoon. Yes, as Maya has rightly put it, the task before me is to briefly deliberate on aspects of the institutional framework that are existing in the region of Africa, which will be then deemed to be useful to build the required capacity enhancement or capacity development for DSI. Yes, coming from the region of Africa, it's important to note that in the past decades, food and research, as noted clearly in the Agenda 2063. Now, Agenda 2063, okay, yes. By Agenda 2063, Africa actually redirected its an enduring Pan-African vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens. Now you see that the dynamics that comes with the Agenda 2063 is that it is premised on 7 aspirations. And aspiration number 1 lays clearly how, as Africa, we would like to aspire in the next 50 years to be prosperous, to have highly standard of living, quality of living, well-educated and skilled citizens who are inspired by science, technology, research, and innovation. Now, the Agenda 2063 in its package calls for the kind of capacity needed in order to attain desired ends that we are looking for right now in DSI. Now, noting from these aspirations, you find that science, technology, innovation, and research is being hinged to be at the epicenter of Africa's socioeconomic transformation, meaning a well-educated citizen that is informed, that is highly learned, to appreciate and to embrace research. Now, linking this directly to the DSI, meaning knowledge or capacity enhancement or development in DSI, certainly would very much inform the needed research, scientific research in building our capacities, our transformation in the field of science, in the field of all the other sectors, thematic areas such as health, agriculture. There are policy almost, as I've said, they are just driving our conversation on the continent. Now we have TISA giving an action plan in our promotion of science from up to 2024. It was about 20-year action plan, and many more. Now, along the path, we have also been involved closely in Africa by the mandate given to the bodies of AU, that is the AUDA, in supporting African countries by enabling them to build regulatory capacities to implement the protocol. That's the Cartagena protocol. We know that protocol comes on to bring a regulatory regime for safe application of the tools of biotechnology. So the decades past, member countries have embraced the policy position of AU and AUDA NEPAD in saying that they build regulatory capacities in place, putting infrastructure that is needed, and enhancing human capacity to be able to make decisions so as they are able to adopt or harness the tools of modern technology, having learned that through these tools, we are able to conserve the environment, have a sustainable utilization of the biodiversity. And also with it comes quite a number of areas that comes with to mitigate some of our challenges. Challenges in the agriculture sector that the tool brings with agriculture, new techniques that improve crop varieties, that improve the quality and productivity from our agricultural sector, that then enhances or enables us to be, in terms of our food security, to be secure. Now, the conversation around DSI is highly embraced because with it, it ushers in a new aspect of or information that will be able to enhance scientific research, as I said. Now, capacity enhancement will enable quite a number of people on the continent, as viewed, to be able to access genetic resources, to use them, to generate, and even be able to analyze digital sequence information. And that's very, very useful in building the areas, the sectors that I've talked about, in health, in agriculture, in the conservation, meaning some of these key information will be able to be able to support the discussion and scientific research that comes along with DSI and in the areas that I've talked about. So in a nutshell, I would say that over the years, the AU has prepared its house, and through some of its implementing agencies, such as the AU DNA pad, been able to support a number of areas in terms of building capacities of regulators, as I've mentioned, enabling them to negotiate or to be able to articulate issues in the discussions that come with DSI, access to benefit sharing, and even those that concern the other protocols of the CBD, such as the Cadena. So I would like to leave it here at the moment, but just to conclude that we highly embrace and institutional frameworks that have been developed at the regional level are also having their penetration through to the domestic setting, where member countries are trying to align their domestic legislations, domestic regulations to meet or to have a convergence with what the AU position has clearly put as its policy position. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Sunday. So we got a broad input, and we also received quite some questions. I'm going to pick up some for each of you, and would like to request that you give a quick answer before we then come to our final section that links capacity development and benefit sharing. So there's I like to pose one question to Amber first, and it was about the origin of these data. And so the question, how were you able to determine the country of origin when so much of the data has no country of origin and submitters continue to refuse to label it? So I think if you could maybe explain how these countries of origin issue is dealt with in the data banks.
Yeah, it's a really important question. Thanks, Hartman. And I've typed a short little answer in there as well. So about 16% of the global data set has country of origin information associated with it. Importantly, not all sequence data should have country of origin information. We don't associate country data with human data, and there's a lot of human data in there, about 12% of the databases. Also, for model organisms that were taken out of the wild 50 to 100 years ago, country of origin is not appropriate. And about 43% of the data should have a country of origin information and doesn't. And that's something I think that the scientific community should really start to look at very closely. It's not quite as simple as to say, you know, stupid scientists refuse to put country of origin information in there. It's a little more complex than that. Because of the high throughput nature of sequencing, the technical connection between sequencing servers and the databases is in many places automated. And there is a technical error that often occurs to translate this information from the sample to the sequence databases. So the databases are aware of this issue. I think that there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in curating the data better. I can say when colleagues and I looked into this 43% missing country information, we also took 100 random publications, sequences, and we asked the question by going back to the publication, what should have been the country of origin? And then we looked at the world map and the geographical distribution patterns where the data was missing country information showed the same global trends. Now, that's only 100, it's a small sample size, but it leads us to believe that the loss of country data is not caused by misconduct, but rather appears to be oversight or carelessness. That's the best we can do with the experiments we've conducted so far.
Yeah.
But I'm optimistic that this is something the community can and should work on.
Yes, thanks a lot. And I have a question for Ahmed. One of the participants reflected on the complex interface between the DSI research and equity, and that apart from, let's say, technical capacity development, which you also reflected upon, the participant asked whether it needs to be a system of governance, whether also in the use of DSI, there should be capacity development in governance issues. That's my question, of course, and also whether there are, this would now be my addition to this, whether there are different recipients, of course, of capacity development, if you talk on scientific and government governance capacities.
I think I fully agree on that, because if we don't have a governance mechanism, we cannot go to the success. We need to coordinate the role and the responsibilities of national institutions involved in advanced biotechnology issues, and also at the regional level, like Sunday said. And governance is as important as what the technical needs I mentioned. And I think that including also, we should, the capacity building can be integrated into broader capacity building initiative or strategies that can be adapted to the need of individual countries or research institutions. But governance mechanisms are very important for us. For Morocco, for example, we still need a coordination mechanism for DSI use, and it's an example, and we are thinking about that.
Okay, yeah. Great. Well, then, I think we just, with that, we can link to Sunday, and I would like to ask you, because you talked about the work in Africa, and we know that there are largely like two fields for capacity development. In general, it's one, human resource development, yeah, that researchers and maybe also people working on governance issue actually can do their job, but also and that also became very apparent in these examples, which I and also Amber showed. There need to be institutional capacity, yeah, infrastructure to really make use of DSI. So I like to ask you, especially now in Africa, has the African Union and AUDA, NEPAD, do you have special programs to actually set up African institutions in biological research, doing like or taxonomy or health research or biotech research? So what is the status of these efforts in the continent itself?
Yes, the status of the efforts that the leadership has had in terms of policy, then institutions, has been visible. As if you follow the page well, we have really, I think, in the field of biotechnology, we have 4 centers. The Northern Africa was tasked to have specialties, not ignoring the others. The Northern part of Africa, I think, in pharmaceutical. The West Africa is to concentrate on agri-biotech. Then I think the Eastern Africa is to concentrate on, I think, animal biotech. Then the Southern Africa part was also have a task in medicine. And those are some of the pillars that have been established, mapped out in order to have some of this development. Now we have centers of excellencies spread across and being championed from the topmost leadership or topmost organs, which are focused very much in many of our thematic areas. And with this come along capacity development for scientists, those that call in regulations, also capacity enhancement for regulators, so that they are able to make sound decisions that are science informed. Yes, quite key, and I think that should be the focus, where we discover that our problem has been that where our policymakers make decisions that are not scientifically informed, then we have actually been staggering, not being able to adopt some of these important key technologies, these tools. But the realization that policies have to be scientifically informed, now I think the conversation is changing gradually, where more and more you had not long in 2007 at the topmost organ, that is the heads of states and governments, the decision that did recognize tools such as gene drive for purposes of fighting malaria and embracing scientific research. So really, in brief, I can say there are broader aspects that have come from the topmost policy level, where countries are slowly embracing and also having a kind of a conversation that comes together as at the regional level, because within the continent we have around 5 RECs, which is regional economic groups. It's around these regional groupings that conversations begin, then they build up to the topmost organ of the leadership, that's heads of states and government. So that's what I can say. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for this overview. And I think with this, I like to come to the last question, which I would pose to Amber, who are, let's say, also on the user side, because as we all know, we undertake these webinars in the context of the CBD discussion on benefit sharing. Yeah, and of course, capacity development is also an important issue. We heard this from Tim in the beginning, and you are working in such institutions who have capacity in a certain way. But when we really look into the discussion now, it was suggested that capacity development might be one form of benefit sharing in the context of a future DSI regime. That has been discussed from various sides, and I think when we see that benefit sharing in the CBD is seen as sharing the benefits arising from the utilization of DSI, it clearly relates to the benefits that come on the user side. So usually, like, capacity development is a lot of, let's say, governmental money, and also Sunday talked about that. But when we really are in the context of the CBD, the users should contribute to benefit sharing and to capacity development. So this would be my last question to the two of us, maybe starting with Amber. What do you think of this angle of, connection between benefit sharing in the CBD and capacity development? So
yes. Yes. I mean, it's the data tell us that it's where we need to go. It's clear that DSI is not something that was on the minds of negotiators in 1992, as Tim talked about. He always thinks about physical resources, or even perhaps in 2010 when the Nagoya Protocol was negotiated. And it's clear this is where biology is happening. If you want to do biotech, if you want to do life sciences, you have to be able to do sequence stuff. or omics technologies writ large. I would say, and again, going back to where Tim started us off at, for it to be part of or seen or viewed or visible or something meaningful in the policy context, which is the CBD in this case, it has to be quantified, right? So my institute, we always have, I don't know, at least 50 international researchers that are here at some point from usually 35 to 40 countries. It's how science is done. That surprises nobody that's worked in a scientific institute, not Ahmed, not anybody. The question is, what counts as capacity development under the context of the CBD? So if we say we want to do that, we have to create some kind of mechanism to be able to count that in a real and robust way. And of course, it's interesting that the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, is supposed to measure things and keep track of things. And one interesting idea that I've heard played around with is the idea of a matchmaking platform, yeah? So like Tinder for scientists and countries, and that you're trying to connect needs across the planet with, okay, I'm a microbial ecologist, I care about, drought-resistant bacterial communities. Maybe that doesn't interest everybody, but maybe there is somebody in Brazil that really cares about drought-resistant bacterial communities. And if there was a matchmaking platform and some kind of funding scheme that stood connected to that, I think that would be incredible. And the neat thing about a platform is you might also have the ability to keep track of connections made, of dollars spent. And I think that there is real room here, not only to do better, to leapfrog, but also to keep better track of it so that we're inspired and we create a virtuous cycle that continues to grow, rather than it becoming the dirty dust in the corner of the new DSI, whatever it is.
Yeah, thanks. We are pretty advanced in time. We have a lot of questions received in our section, and as usual, we can only give a few of them to you. So what we are going to do, of course, as in our other webinars, we are collecting these questions and we try to develop new sessions around them and try to answer them in future webinars. Since we are almost at the end, we have 10 minutes, and I like to thank you, the three panelists, for your contributions and the insights you gave us. And I like to give the final word to Chris Lyle, who should sum up and give us his ideas about what he heard and what he thinks is necessary in the future with terms of capacity development in DSI. Chris works at the National History Museum in London, UK. He's actually a taxonomist and uses DSI for his research, but he also works in the Global Taxonomy Initiative of the CBD. He has co-chaired the ad hoc technical expert group on DSI in 2020 and published a lot on this thing. So he's well versed with the international discussion on DSI. I'm happy to have you here to give us a final input overview about this interesting topic. Chris, please.
Many thanks, Hartmut. Thank you for that introduction. Well versed, but still learning a lot. And I think I've learned a lot over the last hour and a half. And I'd like to thank Tim and the panelists for some really interesting comments. So just try and a bit of summing up what I heard and one of the things I'm trying to put in order. So thinking back to what Tim said, that we're not, I think, just talking about capacity development for digital sequence information. I think we are very much looking at it in the context of the CBD and the protocols of the CBD. And also, obviously today, within the context of the Sustainability Development Goals. And I think reaching some of the SDGs, just like meeting objectives of the CBD, is going to require all of the tools in our toolbox, and DSI is quite clearly one of the tools in our toolbox. We need to make sure it's in everybody's toolbox. So thinking about capacity development, really capacity only has relevance and focus if it's there to meet some sort of need. We can talk about DSI, but in abstract, it's just some letters on a screen. Tim asked if DSI can support the 3 objectives of the CBD. Well, we've had some examples from the panelists on such support. Back in 2017, the Executive Secretary asked governments, other users of the world, basically, for their opinions on the value of DSI to the 3 objectives of the convention, and received a lot of very informative responses to that. And they're all on this SCBD website if you go have a look. It's quite clear that the use of DSI is used to meet objectives of the convention, is used to support the thematic areas of the convention, the cross-cutting issues of the convention, and the biodiversity targets. Yes, I'm a taxonomist, and I've written on the use of DSI in the context, for example, of invasive species identification. Very key element of managing biodiversity. But can DSI be used to its full potential right now? Well, clearly not. I think Amber's presentation showing that the sources of DSI and the publications on DSI and where they came from indicates that, not because it's scientific publications, but because it's showing where the actors are, and indeed where they're not, and where we all, I think, need them more. Going to Tim's forgotten articles, and thinking particularly of Article 17 on exchange of information. Now, I'd say an awful lot is going on under exchange of information. I don't think it's ever labelled Article 17 of the CBD, but it's there. And one of the obvious examples of that is the sharing of information of DSI. It's out there and it's billions in open access databases. Very valuable. Tim referred to siloization. I think here we have 4 articles which are siloed. The data are being shared, but there's very little emphasis, or too little emphasis, on its use and applicability. A book is great, love books, but if I can't get to a library or I can't read, they're useless. And it's all about ensuring that people can get to the library, can get to the open access databases, not only to contribute, which is extremely important, but also to download, to use, to apply these data. So all of those articles, those capacity development articles, should be working together to ensure that the whole can be reached. For simple availability of DSI, it's great, but it's not enough. We've got to ensure that the capacity is present to make use of it. There's capacity of some level in all countries, but clearly not enough. There's still a massive gap. So thinking about what that looks like, and Ahmed gave us a great detailed list of capacity building elements, which is really important. I can think of one bit of delivery in the GTI where the SCBD arranged for training of over 50 participants from 47 countries in DNA barcoding. And this led to projects being funded which actually use those skills, that capacity to address real world problems. But as I think has been said, capacity development, capacity building, it comes at different levels. There's the individual level, training people to be able to do things. That's often not very systematic on an ad hoc basis. And quite often when we're talking about the users of DSI or the user of genetic resources giving capacity development, it's often at that level, that training of individuals. Vitally important, but not enough if the people haven't got anywhere to go. The next level is to ensure that there are institutional homes for those people. There are institutions which are in place, which can support DSI, deliver DSI research and work, and that those institutions are sustainable. And that sustainability may well need a national policy framework. And this is the third level, perhaps, the endorsement by governments of those institutions, of that capacity, and the recognition by governments of how that capacity fits in with their needs. Takes us back to needs. And interesting, thinking about the Agenda 2063 for Africa, a lot of high-level needs have been identified there. And quite clearly, as Sandy said, this is going to provide an institutional home, an infrastructural home for DSI capacity. But only if the need for that capacity is recognized and it can be, if you like, plugged in to the appropriate places. And that's Agenda 2063, but also, of course, we're thinking right now about the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and exactly the same applies. Looking at the draft framework we have at the moment with the goals, the targets, there is another great risk of siloization, of each of these being considered separately, whereas in fact they should be operating together to reach overall biodiversity goals. So we need to think about where, if you're project designing, for example, where are you going to need DSI? Or what do you need to meet the goals? What do you need to meet your needs and objectives? So looking at that DSI capacity, where do we need it? What's it going to deliver? What are the needs it's going to deliver against? We need to resist that potential for siloization. We need to look for synergy across goals and targets, across activity, across different capacity development initiatives, as Ahmed said. So think about the objectives, think about what's needed to achieve them, think about project design and management, and then we'll see, I think, that capacity to generate and make use of DSI is going to be an absolutely key element and can be sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Chris, for these, I think, very thoughtful reflection on the introduction and also the panel. And you almost ended with some guiding questions and points that may then be considered in the future discussions. And I'm quite sure that people will get back to what you said, as it was, as I already mentioned, quite concise and to the point. Thanks a lot for that. We have two further small points now to address. It is that I would like to ask Sandy Akile for some closing remarks on behalf of the African Union Commission and AUDA, before I'll give you a very short snapshot on what we have in front of us in terms of next webinars. Thanks.
Yes, once again, all participants, experts here, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to speak to you on behalf of the AU Commission, the AUDA, on behalf of all leadership for taking part in this virtual meeting. I would like to express my sincere appreciation for your engagement in this meeting, because I know we understand there could have been other competing engagements. Just as we learned today, there is another meeting ongoing about the CBD and others. So, but having made time is really quite encouraging, and it's commendable. I hope that the deliberations were very insightful for you all, and will provide useful information that you will convey to your respective settings, either the capitals or organizations. We hope that will be very useful. I also express my sincere appreciation. This I'll do it on behalf of our leadership to all the partners who have put in their endless support in making these meetings possible. And we are learning there are many more that are in the line for a number of people for the future to come. Now, as Africa, as I did in my brief talk, we really like to stress that the building of capacity in this DSI remains key, and it stands out key, especially towards the implementation of the CBD and its protocols. AUD and AU have been actually working hard with support of partners in the decades that have passed, trying to support member countries in building capacities of scientists, regulators, so that they can be able to implement the protocol. And this has been in the area of the Cartagena Protocol, which is for the safe application of the tools of biotechnology. But now with DSI coming into the conversation, I think conversation around capacity building remains a very important discussion that we'll see and lead the conversation just as guided by Chris in his summation. How do we develop the mechanisms for getting this much needed capacity to the targeted people? As we know, we noticed that capacity built in the area of technology transfer will support and many more in the access, use, generation, and analysis of the digital sequence information, which remains key to us, as I earlier on said. For Africa, we see this a very important area because it very much resonates with Agenda 2063, where we call around for building human capacities generally, so that by 2063, we'll have an Africa that is informed and that is able to lead in aspects and compete in the international arena in the field of science, technology, and innovation for our good, for our transformation, socially and economically. With those few remarks, I would like to end here, but also say I thank the experts who have been able to participate and putting in their efforts, their research to pass this useful information to all of us. Thank you very much.
Okay, now it's me to close, and thanks a lot, Sunday, also for putting this again in the African context, which is a very important one. So what's next? We still have something to look forward to, which is a thematic webinar on the 16th of June. So please put it already in your diaries, and you will also see that the link is now shared in the chat. And this one will be a quite interesting one, looking into commercial applications and considerations of intellectual property in the use of digital sequence information. So here we are busy working on the program, and I can already share that it's going to be a quite interesting mixture of different views and perspectives, and of course some substantial data. There is the second global dialogue on digital sequence information on invitation happening in July, starting in July in June, with a global kickoff, 3 regional time zone bound dialogues, and a global wrap up, where we then happy to report on that prior to the open-ended working group. So this is very much on assessing the policy options against criteria that are being shared and developed by many, including the CBD Secretariat. And more information you can get on both on the websites and the links that are presented here on this very slide. I would like to thank you all for your patience, your interest, your very interesting questions. We will work on them. I'd like to also express my gratitude to the presenters, to the panelists, to the moderators, and also for Chris to having wrapped up in a way. I think it's really very much to the point. Thanks a lot, and see you soon.